In the cockpit of the Mornlight, Dr. Elira Vane coughed softly into a cloth mottled with brown stains. Her partner for this project, Dr. Holt, lounged with his feet propped on the control panel as they watched another green world rise into view from below the bow. Do you ever think about what we're doing? Elira's eyes did not leave the viewport as she asked what had been on her conscience from the start. Entire civilizations burned, trillions dead. And what do we have to show for it? Just enough data to limp us through another year. Holt put an arm behind his head. I think you're not cut out for this job. Her sigh was thin, strangling by the plague. She didn't know how Holt was always so relaxed. I know, but every world we seed, it feels less like we're looking for a cure, and more like we're simply just murdering strangers on a prayer. Holt finally coughed, a dry, rasping bark. Then we're just doing the same thing our ancestors have always done, just with better tools. Jump the drive, Vane. Time to see how the last world fared. The planet was only a short distance away, the nearest in a circuit they passed through last year. They had seeded the planet with the plague to see if its residents would fare better than their own civilization. Their medical tech was staying just ahead of the plague, but that would stop without new data they could synthesize into new treatments. As Elira's fingers danced over the console, she did a double take at all the signatures of a flourishing population. She reached over and checked the logs to make sure the plague had been successfully introduced, that they hadn't sent a dud into the planet's biosphere by mistake. Everything checked. She startled as Holt put a hand on her shoulder, his face lit with a feverish glow. Is that right? He leaned in and redid the scan. Together they watched the planet's genetic registry reveal no signs of the plague. We have to go down there. Holt was the geneticist, and what his scan revealed about the people of Planet 321V was even more unbelievable. Their DNA was so similar to their own that, with only minor cosmetic alterations, they could pass as locals. Holt programmed the data into the machine at the back of their craft and sat in the chair. A claustrophobia-inducing tube slid down from the ceiling around him as pale yellow gas numbed his nerves so the tiny pen-like laser surgical knives could do their work. Holt flinched, not from the pain, but from the knowledge that his face and hands were being reshaped. Elira had only undergone the procedure one other time and found it unpleasant but nothing more. Like the drill used by dentists, only pressure, not pain. But on your face and hands, when the machine finished reshaping them, their reflections were not so different from their original forms, as if the planet's people were uncannily close to their own. I expected gills or something, Holt said as he ran a finger down a facial ridge. These things are just cartilage, not bones. Elira wiggled her fingers, feeling the ridges running along them squeeze her skin uncomfortably. They're so us. How's the plague not wiped them out when their DNA's so similar? Take your suppressants, Holt muttered, swallowing one of the bitter pills. Whatever their deal is, no one takes kindly to travelers coughing up blood on their doorstep. The machine should also have finished our clothes by now. Elira was the engineer. She calculated the departure point, calculating the planet's terrain to make sure they wouldn't bend space into a rock or open a hole in a hill and send loose rock and soil spilling into their craft. She chose a place in the forest near a small settlement, one they could appear to have arrived at after traveling a long, narrow stretch of stones that was likely a primitive highway. She was grateful that Holt didn't know it took her twice as long as usual to prepare a spatial bend. Elira told herself she was just prudent, that she did trust her own work. But all-nighters spent studying for tests her classmates breezed through had taught her that she couldn't rely on smarts that weren't there. When she had finished, they went to the door. Elira nervously activated the spatial bend before Holt unsealed the door, which slid up with silent precision into a peaceful forest of trees not unlike she'd admired on her trips to the countryside. when the plague had gotten to her nerves as much as her lungs. A cool breeze swept the scent of evergreens inside, along with an unfamiliar but recognizable smell of foreign soil. Holt went outside first, stretching his arms to test the primitive fabric the machine had created for them. "Haven't felt plant-based material in years," Elira said, not disliking it. It was rougher than polyfiber, but that was a pleasant reminder that it was part of nature, even if it had been 3D printed in the fabrication oven. They found the highway of flattened stone, which they followed to the edge of a settlement. Wooden hovels with smoke curling from thatched roofs. A simple agrarian folk beneath a pale sky, medieval, nothing but their long fields of corn-like stalks sustaining them. "Here's hoping they don't burn us at the stake as witches," Holt said with a smile as he waved cheerfully at the few locals who'd spotted them. And yet, to Elira's relief, the people greeted them both hospitably and hungry for tales of faraway lands. Holt was more than happy to recite the ones they had both committed to memory, tales crafted by historians and psychologists to present them in a positive light while keeping them benign. Once the villagers had accepted them as nothing but simpler travelers, Elira asked about the plague. They nodded as though recalling an unpleasant summer storm. Yes, the sickness had come like it had made a blood oath against them, but their god had lifted it. Gods were a tricky thing because you never knew if you were expected to know, and what it meant if you didn't. In these cases, the trainers told them the best thing to do was to keep the locals talking and piece together what you could. Holt, of course, didn't have the patience for that. "What name do you call God?" he asked as she adjusted herself in her seat uncomfortably. "We've been traveling for a while, and some people have different names." Elira could have slapped him for breaking protocol, and nearly wet herself when a clear change came over the villagers that she could not place, even though she had never seen religious zealotry on her planet. The plague had gone on for too long for anyone to still cling to the hope that a god would heal them, and for those who said that the plague was a punishment from the heavens, they had been silenced by the Board of Peace long ago. "Veythra," the villagers whispered in chorus. "He who listens." Holt nodded as if it was only a matter of course. "That makes sense. But how did Veythra lift the plague? I mean, was there any kind of—" He made circle motions with his hand, as if reaching for the word, but was unable to grasp it, waiting for the villagers to fill in the blanks. "Perhaps you would like to worship at the altar of Veythra?" asked an elder, eyes ravenous, leaking a barely contained glee. "We'd love to see it," Holt answered. They followed them to the edge of the village. Holt was cautious, despite his earlier nonchalance. As they came closer to a low stone hall, heavy with the iron stink of blood, Elira wished they had never stepped foot on this planet. Flies clung to its threshold. Inside, shadows seemed to rise from an altar of serpentine coils. On it stood a fetish carved from dark stone, tentacles entwining with eyes that Elira swore followed them as they approached. The altar was stained black with dried blood. A knife made from obsidian lay across it, its edge chipped from centuries of sacrifice. Heathen was not a word she would normally ascribe to anything, but this altar stank of a hysteria stitched into a religion. "Veythra receives your blood as a sacrifice for your desire." The mad elder fingered a slash across his own scarred palm, the number of his own wounds revealing a fanaticism that made Elira cringe. What manner of god would even want your blood? What kind would even care that he was being worshipped by one of a billion insects crawling across a rock floating in space? As Elira held in her revolt, Holt cracked the silent reverence of the hall with a brittle chuckle and took up the knife. "What are you doing?" Elira hissed without the universal translator. "It worked, right?" Holt answered back in Terran as he drew the blade across his hand, let his blood spatter onto the stone. "You've got my blood, you rascal. Cure me." The villagers bowed their heads. Elira turned away in disgust. Holt squeezed a few more drops of blood onto the altar. Think he heard that? He smirked as they walked out, his hand dripping a trail of red. I think he heard you call him a rascal. She spit back, horrified at what bacteria that knife had introduced into his body. Wasn't Holt supposed to be the biologist? You need a bandage for that. That night, the chief must have been so pleased at Holt's sacrifice that he invited them to his home for a stew of local plants and fungus, which she noticed Holt scan from under the table with the portacom he'd slipped from his pocket. The elder had given him a bandage for his hand and rambled the entire afternoon about Veythra and everything he'd done for the village. Why did you do that? Elira accused once they were given the elder's extra room to board for the night. The knife. I figured that it had some kind of bacteria that might be the cure, or something in the air in the room that slipped into the bloodstream through an open wound. That's why you let it bleed like that. He arched an eyebrow. I'm not an idiot. There were 2 cots, which pleased Elira, because she was not going to sleep in the same bed as Holt, especially after what he'd done. She knew he'd done it as a science experiment, but she couldn't shake the sight of him squeezing his blood out over that pagan altar. It infected her dreams, twisted them into visions of endless seas of blood and coiling forms. Eyes like satellites peering through a sky of roiling clouds, burning with recognition. She woke to see Holt sitting at the window, watching the sun burn away last night's fog still clinging to the mountains. His eyes were bright, his face flushed like she'd never seen. It worked, he said. What are you talking about? He held up the scanner. No trace of the plague remained in his body. The readings were negative. Elira's voice faltered. You were right. The knife, the air, something. We'll have to test it. He turned back to the window with the same smile as the villagers when they'd led them to that abominable shrine. It isn't environmental. Elira hadn't noticed last night, but she could see the shrine looming at the village edge, a cold spot in an otherwise fine morning. Something here cured the plague. But why, of all places, did they have to find the answer to their prayers on this wretched little planet of cultists? Back aboard the Moonlight, every test confirmed it. Holt was free of the plague. Something here had torn it right out of his DNA when centuries of their own medical technology had barely even halted its advance. She had expected Holt to be pouring through his data, sending messages through hyperspace about how they'd finally found the elusive cure they'd murdered trillions of life forms to arrive at. But he only grew more serene. His cough gone, his head tilted as if listening to something Elira couldn't hear. We need to go back, he said in a way that worried her. For testing, she clarified. Yes, testing. And so they returned. While Elira gathered samples of soil, air, water, anything she could think of, Holt surrendered himself to the villagers' rites. She told herself that he was the geneticist, that he was collecting data under the guise of participation like before. But the more she watched the nightly ceremonies of blood and ecstasy, saw the people writhe, howl, and clawed the air as though mad, the more it became clear that Holt didn't care about samples anymore. She returned nightly to their shuttle, while he spent more and more time at the village collecting scars on his arms, offering his blood to their mad god. The few times he did return for supplies, she did not confront him, too afraid of what this Veythra had turned him into, and what he might now do if she even asked. And then, one night while she was considering leaving him behind to report what they had learned, he returned, carrying the fetish itself. Its stone was slick with fresh blood, and he was draped in the garments of their priests, cradling it as though it were a child. It's time to return, he said, staring at the fetish reverently. Elira swallowed hard to keep herself from screaming. Listen, Holt, I know this is a cure. At this point, I know, and I never thought I'd say this. Is the cure worse than the disease? Holt tilted his head. bird-like, and raised the bloodied fetish to his ear. Veythra told me you would say that. He rushed at her, the fetish raised over his head. Elira tried to shield herself, but the stone idol smashed against her skull with a sickening crack. Holt set the idol in the wetness pooling from her skull, pleased. Holt sat alone in the cockpit, his legs propped on the console. The fetish of Veythra was strapped securely in Elira's seat, its tentacles seeming to twitch excitedly in stars burning cold beyond the glass. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the cleaning robots scrubbing the blood trail leading out the door. Elira did not need to make the return trip. With the push of a button, the Mornlight leapt into hyperspace, carrying with it not only the cure to the plague, but the galaxy's new god.